19.2 was rounds of toes to bars, double unders, and a descending reps of squat cleans, but at an increasing weight. So round 1 was 25 toes to bar, 50 double unders, 15 squat clean at 135, 95 pounds. Then it went to toes to bar, double unders, and then 13 squat cleans at a higher weight, and then 11, then 9, then 7 for the squat cleans. Although most people never got anywhere near that far into the workout. Anyway, Rich Froning was the one who won that workout, and CrossFit Mayhem actually has that posted on YouTube. So I did a bit of video analysis, and I have to say his 19.2 performance was one of the most impressive displays of battery that I've ever seen. At the 135 bar, he did 1 rep every 4.5 seconds, give or take about a half a second, which is insanely consistent and rhythmic, and his speed of movement is really none other. At the 185 bar, he did 1 rep every 5 seconds, plus or minus about 0.7 seconds. So still very little deviation. At the 225 bar, he did 1 rep every 6.5 seconds, give or take about 2 seconds. At the 275 bar, he did 1 rep every 9 seconds, give or take about 3 seconds. And then at the 315 bar, he did 1 rep every 18 seconds, plus or minus about 4 seconds. So to make this clear, after doing 125 toes to bar, 250 double unders, and 48 squat cleans all at 135 or heavier, this man cleaned 315 pounds 7 times in 1 minute and 46 seconds. If you want to be prepared for weightlifting tests in CrossFit, you have to develop battery. The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all one place, zorfitness.com. So today's outline, there's going to be 3 different parts where I'm going to be answering 3 different questions that I think are most relevant to this discussion. Part 1 is going to be, what is it? So what is battery? So I'm going to define it in terms of what it means to me, and then I'm going to talk about some of the physiological systems that are going to, or the underpinnings that are going to allow for an expression of battery. So the physical qualities that we can think about developing. Second part will be, what are we preparing for? So it's cool that we have this quality, but is it actually useful to our sport? Obviously it is for us, but what specifically are we preparing for? So what common testing scenarios are there in the sport of fitness? So part 2 is, what are we preparing for? And then part 3 is, how do you develop battery? So you're creating training structures, or this could be programming. So without further ado, let's jump into part 1. What is battery? So my definition of battery is the ability to be able to repeatedly hit a high percentage of your 1 rep max under fatigue. I'll say that again. The ability to be able to repeatedly hit a high percentage of your 1 rep max under fatigue. And that's my working definition. There's 2 things that are subjective within that definition. For one, what is high percentage? Is high percentage 60%? Is a high percentage 80%? Is a high percentage 95 or 99%? What's high? And then 2 is, what's under fatigue? Like, is under fatigue at over a certain number of beats per minute for your heart rate? Is under fatigue if your blood pressure is high? Is under fatigue if you're sweating a lot and you're in the middle of a workout? We can define fatigues a lot of different ways. And there's a lot of different fatigue signals that could inhibit one's ability to lift heavy under fatigue or one's battery. So I got 2 different examples here that I think are 2 different ends of the spectrum in terms of what battery could be, or just 2 very different examples here. For one, it could be 30 snatches for time at 80%. So say 80% is 200 pounds for a male athlete. They're just going through that, dropping, resetting, and going. That's definitely a battery style of test. Or it could be 3 rounds of a 1K air bike and then 1 clean jerk at 95%. So both of these are going to have fatigue generated in them. But the former, the one with just the barbell, is generating the fatigue through the barbell. Like, that's the thing that's generating the fatigue. Where the latter, the barbell, yes, it's certainly going to create a spike in blood pressure and heart rate, for example, but it's not going to really drive the bulk of the fatigue in that sense, because there's only 3 actual reps that you're doing. However, in the latter, the other movements, like in this case, it would be the air biker was creating the fatigue, and then you just have to put up with that fatigue when you're lifting heavy. So those are two different examples of what it could be. It could be something else that's really generating a lot of the fatigue. It could be the barbell that's generating the fatigue itself, or it could obviously be a blend of those two things, which we see a lot in the sport. The last thing that I think is relevant here is that it doesn't necessarily fit super cleanly into my definition of battery, but I do think it's relevant because someone's ability to have a battery-like quality is going to highly affect this. Anyway, it's a max lift while you're under fatigue. So for example, you get done with a Metcon and you have a 5 or 7 minute window after that Metcon to work up to a max snatch or clean and jerk or something. That would be highly correlated with an athlete's ability for battery. So I'm going to talk about it today, even though maybe it's not necessarily specifically battery. So that'd be my working definition. Let's talk about the physiological systems that are going to be encouraging an excellent battery. Number 1 is maximal strength. So maximal strength is going to be requiring great neural drive. So an athlete's ability to be able to harness a lot of their muscle mass to be able to perform work. It needs great trunk rigidity. So if you were rounding and cleans, or you're unable to maintain your T-spine extension when you're catching a snatch overhead or things like that, you're not going to be able to weightlift well, especially when you're on fatigue. Obviously, positional strength plays a big role in maximal strength because if you're not strong in positions, those high support positions that we talked about in episode 14, then you need to really spend the time developing those, right? So if you're an athlete who doesn't have great front rack mechanics, you don't have a great ankle dorsiflexion where you can stay upright in your torso in the bottom of your squat, you don't have a great overhead position for your overhead squat and your snatch, then you're just not going to be able to express the strength that you have. Like your snatch to back squat ratio might be somewhere around 40%, where it should be closer to 60% if you're an efficient lifter. And that could just be a result of not having the positional strength. So if you think that's you, go back to episode 14 and I'd encourage you to listen to that one. That'd be maximal strength. That's one of the things that's going to allow for a good battery. And especially this is the case when it's prescribed weights, right? So it's obviously like if we have two people and they're both lifting at 85%, it doesn't really matter how strong you are. It's all about your battery at that point. However, if we're lifting at 185 pounds, well, then it certainly matters what your max is. And that's another thing we'll get into. Sometimes it's just a matter of bumping up athletes' maxes so that their ceiling is higher. They're not lifting at such a high percentage in those workouts. Like, for example, Rich Froning's clean jerk might be like 380 or something right now. So that 315 is not right up against the ceiling of what he's able to clean. So it's less of an issue for him. Number 2 would be aerobic qualities. And this is going to require breathing coordination and strength to start out. And that's probably not the thing that most people think of initially. However, I think it's probably one of, if not the most important thing that you can have in order to actually have a good battery is to be able to coordinate your breath and have good strength and depth of your breath so that when you actually go to lift that you can brace and move. So this is something that I talked about in episode 17 on holding your breath. If you go back to that one, where basically in order to be able to express high levels of strength, you have to be able to occlude your breathing, hold your breath for a period of time, create high trunk stiffness and rigidity, like I talked about in the maximal strength piece. So the breathing and the coordination of the breath is super important within that. So you have to be able to breathe off the CO2 after you've actually done a big lift like that, and have to be able to regulate blood pressure even as you're continuing to move through consecutive reps or rounds after that. So not just your ability to be able to do cleans, but be able to get back into the bar or to the rope and like that 19.2 example, continuing to move well. Other things that would be considered in aerobic qualities would be things like cardiac output, which is mainly going to be a result of stroke volume in this case. So the amount of blood that your heart can put out per beat, which again, like that is going to be interplaying in your breathing mechanics. Like for example, if you're not getting full exhales, you're going to lower the amount of blood that's essentially getting back into your heart, your cardiac preload. That's going to affect your stroke volume. So that'll affect your muscular tension. Like all of this interplays with the other things. And we have to just understand that this is a super complicated process. And then lastly, aerobic qualities like muscular endurance plays a role in this as well, because if you have maybe grip limitations or core limitations that are going on throughout like that 19.2 example, that's certainly going to affect your ability to be able to have a endurance quality about you, which is kind of what I mean by saying aerobic. Number 3 then. So it was maximal strength, aerobic qualities, and number 3 would be technical prowess. So technical prowess is going to require pattern fatigue resistance. So in other words, that would be movement-specific endurance. So your ability to be able to maintain skill and position despite high metabolic activity. So even though you are maybe doing, like that example I gave before of like a 1K air bike into one clean and jerk at 95%, your ability to be able to deal with those fatigue signals and to be able to still hit all the positions that you need and do that in the correct sequence for your clean and jerk and be able to have those positions not break down, and the skill and the sequencing of that pattern not to break down is super important for that. So those are all things, and that was, by the way, not an exhaustive list of things that are different physiological underpinnings for what encourages an athlete to have a really good battery. However, my encouragement to you would be not to get lost on the weeds in this one. So don't get lost in the weeds. Don't pick one physiological quality and tailor your training to improve it. That's how you get like tunnel visions, and things get missed when you do that. Do prepare yourself or your athlete for the type of test that they need to improve upon. So take a more holistic approach. So do prepare yourself for the kind of test that you need and the qualities that you need, and don't go after one specific metric or quality and tailor all your training around that to try to get better at that one thing, because you'll miss other stuff. For example, say I have an athlete who did poorly on 19.1, which was a 15-minute AMRAP of wall balls and rowing. I'm not going to say to them, your stroke volume wasn't as good as it needs to be, or your VO2 max isn't what it needs to be. Which, by the way, that could very well be the case. Like if your cardiac output isn't enough, you're going to occlude on a bigger set of wall balls, and you're going to not be able to perform well in subsequent sets. However, that's not going to be what I do, and it's certainly not going to be what I say to my athlete, because they're not going to understand that, and they don't need to as the athlete. I am going to say, hey, we need to get you at like these aerobic power type events that involve a height or a power standard. So with both like a wall ball and a row, unlike something like a pull up or a power clean where you're moving it relative to your height to get through a range of motion, and it's relative to your body size and limb length, those movements are standardized to a height. So it's either 10 feet or 9 feet. So if you're a tall person, that's going to benefit you. Same thing with the rower. It's like a tall people are benefited. So it's not just about, what's a specific metrics that we need to improve upon. So if we just improve an athlete's VO2 max, for example, so we have them do maybe a bunch of air bike intervals, and we get them to have a way better 10-minute test and their VO2 max is better, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to go back to 19.1 and actually have an improved performance. So we need to actually take this as a more global, holistic approach and just think about, okay, what kind of things do we need to get them better at? How can we then dose that athlete to get them better at those things? And that's the exact same thing that you're going to do with battery. So let's go into part 2 here. What are we preparing for? So let's go back in time and look at different common testing scenarios. So I'm going to go open, sanctionals, games. We'll see if this actually holds up in future seasons, if we'll continue to see sanctionals are the same way that they were for now, but that's a conversation for a different day. Let's go into open test examples. So obviously there was 19.2 from the intro, toes to bar, double unders, squat cleans. And again, that got really heavy for most people where they didn't get close to that. And honestly, for a lot of people, it's just because like toes to the bar and double unders are so anaerobic and so inefficient for a lot of people that they just burn out and they aren't able to maintain good positions when they get to the clean just because they're too tired. Other examples of what I would consider to be examples of battery from the open would be something like 12.2. 12.2 was an AMRAP for 10 minutes. Which is basically like how far can you get into the sequence of snatches. So it was only snatches. It was 30 snatches at 75-45, 30 snatches at 135-75, 30 snatches at 165, 100, and then max snatches, so as many as you had in the remaining time at 210 or 120. So for high-level athletes, this is definitely a battery test. I mean, even for people who aren't as high level, it's still a battery test. It just happens sooner for them. So it might happen at the 135 bar instead of the 210 bar, for example. But that's a really good example of how you have to earn the right to be able to lift heavy. And that's usually the case in the open. With all these, you'll see that the bar weights typically climb. So it's ascending weights, and usually reps will descend as that happens. So for another example of that would be 17.3, which was chest to bar pull-ups in an ascending rep scheme. So each round of that, the chest to bar reps went up, and descending reps of a squat snatch, but a climbing weight once again. So it went up to 265 or 185 for males and females respectively. And once again, then that was like basically maxing out at the end of a long Metcon for a lot of those athletes, and be able to be confident and be able to have all those qualities I talked about, like high rigidity and skill maintenance through fatigue to be able to perform well on that test. 20.4, that one's a little bit more recent in our minds. Those box jumps and clean jerks. And then that weight continued to get heavier on the clean jerks. And then it moved into pistols and clean jerks in the later rounds, all with an ascending weight. Once again, going up to like a 315, 205 pound weight for males and females. Those are the things that I would say fit very squarely into my definition of battery. Other examples of things that I think are more on the fringe or the edges of what I would define as a battery would be 14.3. So that was a couple of box jumps and deadlifts, with the deadlift bar having an ascending weight each time. So that actually got up to 365 or 225 for males and females. And I say that's on the fringe because I think that's more of a strength endurance type test. And I just say that because I think there was a lot of reps before that. And I think the strength endurance played probably a bigger role than a battery example. So I just think the reps climbed a little bit quicker there. And that's what caused that to be on the fringe of what I would define as battery. I actually recently did a whole article, a pro article on strength endurance. Even if you're not a pro member, you can trial pro on the site and you could read that. Check it out. It's zorfitness.com/pro-trial if you want that free week. So check that out. It was just my article on strength endurance, and I broke down programming examples of how you could improve it, how you can test for it, a whole bunch of other stuff. So my other example of what I would consider on the fringe of battery would be something like 15.1A. So 15.1 was a 9-minute AMRAP, and then from minutes 9 to 15, so directly after the Metcon, you went into a max clean and jerk. And I just think this is much more an example of a 1 rep max strength test versus a battery test. Because frankly, there you could, and there's people that did sandbag the first part because there was no minimal work requirement. So you basically could maybe do a few rounds at like an easy pace and then just smash the clean and jerk. The people that like won the clean and jerk, that was the case, is like they just sandbagged the first part of the workout. Whereas something like 18.2 and 18.2A, it was a for time part, and the lifting time cap was built into, the lifting part was built into the time cap. So you had 12 minutes to do the workout and the lift. So you had to finish all of the work before you could do the lift. And I think that had a much bigger impact on strength, endurance, and battery in an example like 18.2A, which was like that 1 to 10 dumbbell squats and bar facing burpees into a 1 rep max squat clean. Actually, I think it was just a clean. Anyway, so that would be examples of all open tests. Obviously, you can probably see some of the themes in that. So I'll move on, but we'll come back to it later. Sanctional test examples. I just have 2 here. One was from the 2019 French Throwdown. It was event 8. It was a ski and snatch ladder. So it was every 75 seconds. Basically, athletes are rotating through different stations with a ski erg and a bar that's loaded at a certain weight. It was every 75 seconds, and it was maybe 8 to 12 intervals, depending on the strength level of the athlete. It was an 8-calorie ski, or 6 for females, and 1 snatch at an ascending weight, which I think maybe it started at like 80 kilos or something, and people are going up to the 120 range, maybe, the better athletes. So yeah, going through several of those intervals, and I think that's a really good example of battery. And then the other one that I pulled was the 2019 Rogue Invitational, was a squat clean ladder. And I don't think all speed clean ladders or snatch ladders are in a battery example, even though it's multiple reps. I think sometimes they're more like 1 RM tests. However, this one I think was light enough for the best athletes in the world that I was actually a test of battery. So it was for time, 10 squat cleans at 185, 125, 8 squat cleans at 225, 145, 6 squat cleans at 255, 165, 4 squat cleans at 285, 185, and 2 squat cleans at 305, 205. 305 and 205 for the best athletes in the world is well under their max. And then lastly, what would be our games test examples? I've one from each of the last 4 years here. 2017 event 9 would be the clean and bar muscle up ladder. So they had to do 4 bar muscle ups, each on its own bar, which was kind of interesting. They moved through and then they'd walk down the floor and pick up a different bar. There was probably 8 or 10 bars on that floor, and they had to do, I think, like 2 cleans at each one, and they got up to 350. So yes, that bar got up to a 1 rep max for a lot of the athletes. However, you had to earn it. So I definitely think that's a battery type effort. In 2018, event 7, which was Fibonacci, it wasn't the final like it was the year before, but it was actually like like halfway through the week in event 7. The beginning part of that workout was definitely a battery type effort, which is unique. And that's why I put it in here. It was 5, 8, 13 of a parallel handstand push-up and a double kettlebell deadlift at 203 or 124 per hand for males and females. So a very heavy kettlebell deadlift and a very difficult overhead pressing version. 2019 was the year that they had all those national champions. Event 1, the first cut, was 4 rounds of 400 meter run, 3 legless rope climbs, and then 7 snatches at 185, 130. And I think those snatches are really what captures the battery aspect of it. And something that's a little bit lighter for games level athletes, or most of the ones who are actually going to qualify and go to the next portion of that. That wasn't very heavy, but it was certainly heavy enough where it played a factor in the ability to be able to run and do the legless rope climbs well. So I think that's certainly a battery style effort. 2020, event 1 was the 2007 reload. This was the one at the ranch just recently when I'm recording this. It was a 1K row into bar muscle ups and heavy push jerks. It was 235 for the men. I'm blanking on the weight for the females off the top of my head. I remember Noah Olson saying he wanted to split jerk those. So that's kind of where he was at, where as he got fatigued, you want to go to an easier variation, but he was on like one of those green mats and he couldn't actually do a split jerk. So he was forced to do a push jerk, which I think that really shows like what style or what qualities are demanded of those athletes in those situations. So I think that's a really good example of, once again, battery. So let's look for themes in this now. So we just went through open, sanctionals, games. What are some themes that we see from these different tests? Number 1, it's typically some variation of a snatch or a clean and jerk. And often it's a full lift. What I mean like is it's like a squat clean or a squat snatch, for a lack of a better term. And it's almost always coming from the floor. So you're very rarely allowed to use a rack, especially for the open. The open has never used a rack, so it's always coming from the floor. And this has some implications. For example, obviously a power clean is going to be a hinge dominant movement. So a hip hinge, like extending at your hip, that's what's dominating the majority of the movement. And that's what's required of you in that case. And obviously like a squat clean is going to be a squat dominant movement because you're squatting. Yeah. But a squat clean actually is going to involve both a hinge and a squat because it's coming from the ground. So you're pulling it from the ground up to extension, and then you're squatting underneath of it and standing it back up. And a squat snatch, obviously it's a squat, but it involves a hinge because it's coming from the ground. And the only real exceptions to this would be moderate to heavy front, overhead, or back squats, since, like rep 1 is coming from the floor, but after that, you're able to just squat. Like you don't have to go back through the hinging pattern. And then the other thing is like a bounced hang power snatch or a hang power clean, like where you use that bounce kip and you stay really upright through your torso, which is one of the main advantages of doing that besides just cycle speed, is that you don't have to use a hip hinge and it's less metabolically taxing for a lot of athletes if you can actually maintain it. But again, mainly snatch, mainly clean jerk variations, mainly from the floor. And that's stuff we have to remember as we're preparing yourself or your athletes for battery style tests. And then lastly, part 3 is how do you develop your battery? So creating training structures, we'll talk programming. So to start off, if you constructed a bunch of training that looked like, let's call it appropriate versions of the kinds of tests that I described in the last section, well, then you're off to actually a really good start. So if you just did that, you would eventually start to develop the qualities that you need for the sport and the testing body of the sport. But before we even go into that and we start to take all of those different examples and we just start to throw them into our training, let's back up and say, like, first of all, is battery something that you actually need to work on? And this is not the case for every athlete. So the first thing you need to do is establish a baseline. So I'm going to give you an example of a battery test. And this is something that we did several months ago now in the protocol, which is our online training program, zorfitness.com/the protocol if you want to check it out. But it was 2 parts, and part 1 is an 8-minute clock. So you have an 8-minute timer to find a power clean 1 rep max. So you're establishing a 1 rep max there, and then from minutes 8 to 12, you're going to rest. And then at minute 12, you're going to start an 8-minute AMRAP of power cleans at 90% of your established 1 rep max. So obviously part 2 is what's testing battery. So if you are someone who does this, a little help to interpret your results. If you get a score on this, so like say you, whatever number of power cleans you got in that 8-minute window at 90%. If it was 15 reps or less, I would define that person as having a good 1 rep max relative to their battery. So in other words, their battery needs development. And this could be somebody like, for example, if we had a weightlifter that was coming out of competing in weightlifting and into the sport of CrossFit, then they obviously are going to need development of their battery and not necessarily their 1 rep max capabilities. So someone like that, probably well under 15 reps on that test. If we have someone else, maybe in the 16 to 22 rep range, that's where I would just consider to be a good acceptable range for a CrossFit athlete. And then above 22 would be, I would say, someone who is highly enduring and has a lot of the qualities that they need for battery in that specific, and like enduring in that specific way, where really for that person, they're fine on the battery end of things. They need to work on their 1 rep max. And likely for the person who got that many reps, their 1 rep max is not developed to the point where it's competitive for the sport. So for example, let's say we have one athlete and they got 27 reps on the battery test, and this athlete can power clean. This is a male athlete and they can power clean 255, but they want to go to a sanctioned event. Like, that's not high enough in terms of your 1 rep max to be able to actually go to an event like that. So you need to spend time developing your 1 rep max. And in turn, that battery score is going to go down. When your 1 rep max goes up, that battery score will go down and probably actually go into sort of an acceptable range. And that's fine. On the other side of things, we often have people who can, maybe, for example, maybe they can power clean 335 as a male, and they can only get 7 reps on the test. They've spent a lot of time developing the neural qualities and the qualities that they need in order to be able to lift 1 rep really heavy. But they need to be able to do that again and again and again, and they need to put more of their training resources into developing their battery. So if you're someone who does this test, reach out to me. Let me know at ben.wise on Instagram or at zorfitness, and I'd be happy to add this into my battery resources, first of all, where I get your info, just selfishly. But then also, like, I'd really be happy to give you some advice on like what you could do for training moving forward. Yeah, people who actually reach out to me via, if it's social media or just email me, like I do take the time to actually respond to you, and I try to make that a point. Reach out to me. So that's the first way that you'd interpret your results, just the number of reps that you got. However, the other thing that you can do is start to analyze, is something that is pattern specific, or is it more so generalized? We have 3 different examples of people here. Avatar number 1 would be someone who they can do really well on that power clean battery test, but if they did the same test for squat cleans, they would do poorly. So that'd be one example. Avatar number 2 would be maybe their cleans are fine, whether it's a squat or power clean, but snatches or jerks or other overhead movements are an issue where they don't perform as well on that on a battery test. And then the third avatar would be like all patterns are relatively balanced and they all need, for example, they all necessarily need battery development, or their 1RMs are all not as good as they need and their battery's fine. And they just need to develop the other qualities. That's another way to think about it. What patterns specifically need development for that athlete? So after you've done the test, you can then begin to take those tests and construct training protocols based on that. So I have 4 different examples that I'm going to go through. 4 different, I won't call them progressions, but there are different styles of things that you could progress for battery development. So the first one is going to be interval strength work. So this is things like you're doing strength work as an EMOM or every 90 seconds or every 2 minutes. Number 2 is going to be fatigue strength work. So you're doing something to fatigue yourself and then going into strength work. So for example, 1K row into 5 squat cleans at 80%. Number 3 will be active recovery intervals. So for example, you could do a 20-minute air bike at a moderate pace, and then every 3 minutes, you're going to do 6 back squats at 75%, some sort of strength work in the middle there. And then number 4 is going to be comp simulations, where this is really just like retesting workouts or constructing things that are like open or qualifier workouts, where it's like a rounds for time environment with ascending weights and like the barbell keeps getting heavier, or it's like a Metcon with a max lift after it. So let's go down through these one by one. I'm going to give some additional examples for each. Number 1 is that interval strength work. So example 1, EMOM for 8 minutes, 3 power cleans at 78%. You drop and reset between. So that would be 24 total reps if we're talking about volume. Another example, every 3 minutes for 5 sets, 8 back squats at 74%. So that's just like strength work. It's really no different than 5 sets of 8 back squat. It's just that you're determining how often they're actually doing that. So you're having a certain work rest ratio for that athlete. Another example, every 20 seconds until failure, or if you accumulate 30 reps, whichever comes first, 1 power snatch at 82%. Another example, 3 sets, every 6 seconds for 2 minutes, you're going to do 1 clean jerk at 155, 105, which would be like a DT weight. And then you'll rest 3 minutes, and then you're going to repeat that again. So it's basically like you're doing interval double grace, which is going to take you 12 minutes because the volume of that is 60 clean jerks. And that is slightly heavier weight. It's like 20 pounds heavier. So those would all be examples of interval strength work. Pretty simple. It's just a barbell and manipulating different types of rest. Our second example is fatigue strength work, which again, you're doing something to get yourself tired and then lifting heavy afterwards. So this is demanding more of the aerobic system. It's demanding more of the respiratory system and demanding more of positional strength and strength endurance. So one example, 4 sets, 1K row at your 2K time trial pace, 15-second rest transition, 5 squat cleans at 80% as fast as possible, drop and reset. Or it could be 5 rounds, 1K air bike into 3 full snatches at 75%, resting 1-to-1 between rounds. So maybe it took you 2.5 minutes, you're going to rest 2.5 minutes and then repeat. Every 4 minutes times 3 sets, 100 double unders, 10 or 8 cal ski at a minimum of 1,400 or 1,000 calories an hour. And then 1 clean plus 1 front squat plus 1 jerk at 88% of your clean and jerk. Our third example would be active recovery intervals. The example I gave was a 20-minute air bike at, let's say it's a zone 2 heart rate. So that'd be definitely a moderate effort, not super hard. And then every 3 minutes, you're doing your back squats, 6 back squats at 75%. So this is one way where you could just be doing sets of your strength work and just sort of doing an active recovery between. So for example, it could just be like 5x5 back squat with a 2-minute bike erg at a damper of 1 at a 220 pace per K. And that would be like really easy. It's just like another way to sort of help your aerobic system continue to be able to flush, continue to be able to develop the qualities that you're going to need for battery. Another example would be 25-minute air runner for distance on the minute, 1 deadlift at 87%. So this is something where it's about blood pressure management and it's about a regulation of tension through your core, because you're going to need to be super rigid and to be able to occlude your breathing for maybe anywhere from like 2 to 5 seconds, depending on how grindy that lift is for you. And then you have to be able to transition quickly and be able to flush out your legs as you're actually running, which is a definitely an impressive quality to have and something that you need in our sport. 10-minute ski at zone 2 at 1, 4, 7, and minutes 10. You're going to perform a max number of unbroken shouldered overhead at 225 or 160 pounds for males and females, and the bar's got to come from the floor. And then lastly would be your comp simulation. So this is your rounds for time environment. You're going to have ascending bars. You're going to have potentially a max lift after a Metcon. If you do lift heavy to a max, it's always going to be on a clock where you have a limited number of attempts. This is stuff that you're going to be doing in comp prep a lot. For example, you could be doing things like a 20.5 retest. You could be doing 19.2, like again from the intro. You could be doing 18.2 and 18.2A, like that. Those styles, like all of that would fit into this. And I guarantee if you take some of the stuff that we talked about today, some of the examples and the protocols, and apply it to your training, you are going to get way better at weightlifting tests in the sport of fitness and ultimately develop your battery. Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.